Did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do, just because you were easy to blame?
I can still see the candlelight flickering on the cake I never got to cut, the plates of half-eaten pasta cooling in front of our relatives, and the exact moment my sister lifted her glass of wine with that practiced dramatic pause that always signals she's about to make the evening about herself. She stood, placed her other hand flat against her stomach like a Broadway actress playing to the cheap seats, and with a smile that could light up an entire county fair, she declared, "Big news. I'm expecting." The words seemed to hang in the air like a firework, and then the room erupted into cheers so loud the waiter almost dropped the dessert tray he was carrying past us. I sat there with my mouth curved into what must have looked like a smile, though inside it felt like my jaw was locking shut. What followed was a blur of clapping, hugging, and relatives tripping over one another to be the first to congratulate her. My mom cried, my dad raised his glass, and even my aunt, who hadn't spoken a kind word to me since I borrowed her car in high school, wrapped Melissa in a hug, like she'd just announced the cure for cancer. Meanwhile, the candles on my cake sputtered out one by one until nothing was left but smoke curling into the air. No one even thought to sing. No one noticed me sitting there, the actual reason we were all gathered at that restaurant in the first place. My 32nd birthday might as well have been canceled the moment Melissa opened her mouth. I've had years of practice watching my sister take the spotlight. From school recitals to family reunions, Melissa always had a way of turning other people's occasions into her own stage. It was her signature move. At my college graduation, she showed up with an engagement ring and made sure every photo featured her flashing it in the air. At my promotion party years later, she interrupted the toast to announce she and her husband had just bought a new house. And now, at my birthday dinner, she was doing it again, stealing my night and dressing it up as just sharing joy. The table was full of people who should have known better, but they ate it up every single time. I picked up my glass and held it steady, waiting for the room to settle. I could have snapped. I could have told her she'd ruined another milestone for me. I could have let the bitterness boil over and given my relatives the kind of family drama they gossip about for years. But instead, I clinked my fork against the glass, raised it toward her, and said, "To Melissa." My voice sounded calm, maybe even warm, though my stomach felt like it had swallowed a stone. Everyone joined in, oblivious to the fact that my so-called smile was stretched thin enough to cut skin. The rest of the evening blurred into a theater I didn't audition for. My parents whispered excitedly about baby names. My cousins speculated about godparents. My grandmother reached across the table to squeeze my hand, only to quickly retract it when Melissa giggled and said, "This baby is going to be spoiled rotten." The focus never shifted back, not once. Even the waiter who finally brought the cake slid it in front of me with a distracted congratulations for my sister, as if the frosting had been ordered in her honor. I played along, nodding when people made comments, even offering Melissa a polite hug before we left. She smelled of perfume and triumph, and her whisper in my ear was almost too low for anyone else to hear. "Sorry, sis, bad timing, I know." The words dripped with fake apology, the kind that only deepened the wound instead of healing it. I pulled back, forced another smile, and walked to my car alone, carrying the birthday gift bags like evidence from a crime scene. On the drive home, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I could hear my dad's voice replaying in my head, saying, "This is the happiest day of our lives," as though the day had no other reason to exist but Melissa's uterus. I thought about how many times I'd swallowed moments like this before, letting them pass with a shrug or a quiet rant to a friend later. But this time felt different. Maybe because it was my birthday. Maybe because the hollow applause of that restaurant still rang in my ears. Or maybe because I finally realized that if I didn't take control of my own narrative, I would die invisible in the shadow of someone who thrived on being seen. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone to vent. I poured myself a glass of cheap wine, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I stared at the blinking cursor, the empty status box waiting for words. Melissa thought she had stolen my night, but she had no idea I was holding on to something she couldn't compete with. Something that would shift the ground right under her feet. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my mind running through exactly what I needed to say, how I needed to frame it, and the reaction I wanted it to cause. By the time I shut the laptop, I knew one thing for certain. My silence at that dinner wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Melissa could have her cheers for one night, but I had already planned the morning after. And when I pressed post, I wasn't just making an announcement, I was reclaiming every moment she had ever stolen. On the morning after the dinner that never truly belonged to me, I woke to a kitchen still carrying the faint vanilla scent of the uneaten cake. And as the coffee machine rumbled to life, I let the steam fog the window while that old reel of greatest hits played again in my head, a highlight compilation of every time my sister had turned my life into her backdrop. Which is a funny way of saying that people do not become insufferable in one night. They practice, they rehearse, and the rest of us pretend it is charming because calling it out would make holidays complicated. I remembered the graduation where I stood in a wrinkled robe, cheeks sore from smiling for photographs I would not keep, while Melissa floated through the crowd with her new ring held up like a lighthouse beacon. I replayed the promotion party where my manager finished an awkward toast just in time for her to clap, wave, and chirp that she and her husband had closed on a house with a wraparound porch and a kitchen island, which somehow gave my relatives more to discuss than the 5 years I had spent grinding through projects that made other people's names look smart. These were not catastrophes, I told myself as I stirred the coffee with a spoon that had gone slightly crooked in the dishwasher's heat, but they were tiny cuts that never healed, and the body keeps score even when the family group chat insists everything is love. The truth that I did not say out loud, not even to my friend Jordan who can sniff out my moods from a single syllable, is that I had learned to operate like a locksmith working by touch, planting small hinges in plain sight, turning a pin here and a pin there until a door that had been stuck for years gives with the softest click, because clumsy revenge is loud and childish, while patient revenge is a velvet rope that drops without a sound, and suddenly the room you thought you owned is no longer yours. I washed the lone plate in the sink, placed it in the rack like a white flag I did not mean, and opened the calendar where my private milestones lived, not the performative ones, the real ones. The ones I had kept quiet because I had wanted to enjoy them clean and undisturbed, like the first 10 minutes of a movie before someone starts asking who that actor is. There was the meeting circled for the following week, the email thread with my attorney bookmarked and neat, the draft packet with signatures that had finally been gathered after months of small humiliations and bigger negotiations, and the thing itself that I would not name even to myself, because naming it felt like setting it loose before its time. I laughed, quietly because there was no audience, at the memory of Melissa leaning in after the dinner, her perfume heavy and sugary, whispering that she was sorry about the timing with that coy half smile that always pretended innocence and always carried a blade, and I realized that the apology was not meant to soothe me at all, but to brand the evening, to stamp it into family memory as the sweet accident that the entire table would defend if I ever dared to object later. It is difficult to compete with a narrative that prearranges forgiveness, and it is even more difficult to argue with people who have decided long ago you are the sturdy one, the reasonable one, the one who makes room. So I decided not to argue, which felt like a small rebellion and a larger relief, because the argument would have been theater, and I was done playing supporting roles in a genre that exhausted me. What I did instead was brisk and almost boring, which is the secret to making a bright thing feel inevitable. I drafted a message to the family thread, and I wrote it in the tender tone that always puts my mother at ease. And I thanked everyone for coming to the dinner with words that sounded humble but were trimmed like a hedge, and then, without bitterness or sarcasm, I added a line that landed with the softness of a feather and the weight of a safe, saying that I had an update of my own to share the next morning at 9, and that I would appreciate everyone being by their phones for a short announcement. I sat with the sentence the way a jeweler sits with a ring under the loupe, checking every edge for burrs, removing anything that could be dismissed as petty, letting only anticipation remain. Because nothing rattles a showman like the promise of a better show on the next day's bill. The read receipts ticked green in waves, my father with a thumbs up that felt like a paper cup at a wildfire, my mother with a stack of excitable exclamation points I chose not to decode, my aunt with a heart that, to her credit, might have been sincere. And then the dots appeared for Melissa, the little ellipses that informed me she was typing, pausing, typing again, and what finally arrived was a short "oh wow" followed by that careful question about whether everything was okay, which sounded generous, but smelled of panic, and I answered in a phrase so mild it could have been printed on a tea bag, that everything was more than okay, and I would be grateful for everyone's attention tomorrow. I put my phone face down and let the quiet expand until my apartment felt like the waiting room of a courthouse, disinfected and humming, and in that quiet I admitted the messy truth I usually hide from myself, which is that I wanted her to feel the wobble, that fractional tilt in the floorboards. When you realize the house you thought was centered might not be, that first slip of control that reveals how much energy you have spent on being adored. Before noon I took a walk, not because I needed fresh air, but because movement keeps me from fiddling with a plan until I ruin it, and I let myself smile at a memory I rarely touch. The one where I am a kid on a playground and Melissa is performing cartwheels while I am at the monkey bars, counting my grips until my palms burn. And it occurs to me now that people think the most impressive thing is always in the center of the circle with the applause, when sometimes the real feat is the quiet endurance at the edge where no one is cheering yet. I came home, opened the freezer, cut a sliver of the leftover cake while it was still cold enough to be almost ice, and ate it standing up like a thief, which felt appropriately ceremonial. And I told myself that the line I had dropped into the group chat was not theater after all, but a boundary painted in a color subtle enough that only those who had stepped over it 100 times would finally notice it was there. The first phone call came in the early evening, my mother fretting about whether my news would overshadow Melissa's and whether we should perhaps wait a week to keep the peace, and I listened with the patience of a doctor hearing a familiar complaint, then told her, softly, that my life would not be scheduled around other people's headlines anymore, and that if anyone was worried about fairness, they might recall the many years when fairness was apparently a seasonal flavor. She sputtered a little and recovered, promised to be by the phone at 9, and I thanked her, meaning it more than she knew, because support offered reluctantly is still support, and the clock, obedient and indifferent, kept inching toward morning. By the time the sun slid down and the apartment turned the color of cooled ash, I had set alarms, drafted the exact words I would use, and aligned the pieces that did not look like pieces unless you had been keeping track as long as I had. And as I shut my laptop, I realized I had already taken a first, small slice of satisfaction, not from the attention I would receive tomorrow, but from the knowledge that Melissa went to bed without the certainty that has always tucked her in, and that my gentle little line in the family thread had done what 1,000 accusations could not, which is tilt the mirror so that she finally had to look at something other than her reflection. At 9 on the dot, when the morning light was doing that soft, forgiving thing it does to a kitchen that was not cleaned as well as I pretend, my scheduled post slid into the world with the quiet authority of something that has been rehearsed and notarized. And although I had written and rewritten those lines until the commas lined up like disciplined soldiers, the effect still startled me, because the phone began to hum like a hive almost immediately, and I watched the first wave of messages stack up before I allowed myself a breath long enough to taste the coffee. I had chosen a photograph that said everything without saying it the way an ultrasound image shouts in grayscale. Mine was a close-up of a heavy, embossed seal pressed into thick paper, the kind that leaves a crater you can feel with your fingertip, flanked by a ring of keys on the table and the corner of a contract peeking into the frame, and beneath it a caption that sounded like relief instead of triumph, a sentence about doors that take years to open and the patience it costs a person to hold the handle without twisting too soon, followed by a line promising more when the ink settled, which is to say I gave everyone enough to gasp at without giving them the vocabulary to argue with. The comments flew in from people who have never once liked my photos of sunsets or soup but will sprint across the internet to cheer anything that smells like a milestone, and while I will not pretend their excitement did not soothe the raw place last night had left, I also will not pretend I did any of this for them, because the truth is that I aimed the entire announcement like a single, well-placed spotlight at a stage hog who has never learned to share. My mother called within a minute, her voice already pitched high with questions she could not form fast enough, and my father texted a thumbs up followed by words that sounded suspiciously like pride. And my aunt sent a message with so many exclamation points it read like a fire alarm. I answered none of them, because if the theater has taught me anything it is that timing belongs to the director. And I had spent enough birthdays forgiving other people's improvisations to deserve a deliberate beat of silence. Jordan's name lit the screen next, and when I picked up, she did not waste a second on small talk, instead exhaling that half-laugh she saves for moments when my restraint finally breaks in my favor, and she asked whether I felt it yet. The delicious physics of a table turning without anyone hearing the gears, and I told her I felt steady rather than giddy, which surprised even me, because I had expected revenge to taste like sugar when in fact it tasted like clean water after a long climb. We spoke in the shorthand that comes from years of trading postmortems after family gatherings, and I confirmed what she already suspected, that the photograph carried more than one story, that the keys were not decorative, that the paper was not ceremonial, and that later, when I chose, I would make all of it explicit. For now, the image would do the lifting on its own, and the caption would do the quiet work of setting the tone so that anyone tempted to call me dramatic would have to reach past a veneer of composure to do it. Then Melissa called, and even before I answered I could feel the air shift the way it does when a summer storm rolls in without a cloud, because her ringtone, which I have never changed out of habit or superstition, carries a Pavlovian flutter of dread. And I steadied myself at the counter before pressing the green circle. Her voice arrived bright with counterfeit warmth, a theater smile you can hear, and she congratulated me with words that were technically kind, overwritten with the stiff punctuation of someone reading from a script titled Good Sister. While underneath the lines I could hear the real question forming like condensation on a glass. What exactly had I posted, and how big was it, and why did it look expensive, and why had I not told her first, and would it? In the calculus she runs unconsciously outshine the news she had floated above my cake like a parade balloon. I did not relieve her curiosity, not yet, and instead I thanked her as though I believed every syllable. And I told her more would be clear by noon, and I asked how she was feeling, which is a kind question on paper, but carries a mirror in its frame when delivered to someone who is allergic to being asked about anything that is not applause. She pivoted, the way she always does when a conversation refuses to sit in her lap, and she mentioned, in the tone of a person checking for loose boards, that it might be considerate to wait, that early pregnancy is delicate, that family attention can feel like a necessary vitamin, and that she would hate for the stress to affect anything important, and I let her finish every careful sentence before I replied with a calm so even it sounded like a held chord on a piano, saying that my news had been a long time coming and that I would not push it into the shadows out of respect for a pattern that had learned to call itself love. We sat in a silence that snugged around the call like wool, and I could feel her pulse through the line, quick and irregular, and then she cleared her throat and told me she was happy for me again, which did not land as an olive branch so much as a flare shot into a night sky to see what the terrain looks like. By 10, the post had done what it was built to do. Cousins were resharing it with captions that made my name look different to people who had spoken it like a lowercase word. Colleagues were sending notes that combined congratulations with the faint tone of "oh, that explains the late nights." My mother had escalated to voicemail too with a plea for specifics. And Melissa's ellipses kept appearing and disappearing in our private thread as if she were trying to type her way back into control. I poured another coffee and let the messages stack like plates after a party, and I looked again at the photograph I had taken the night before, the one with the seal and the keys and the crisp corner of a page that bore a title I had cropped out on purpose, and I felt that sweet, quiet click of a lock I had worked for years to open, because this was not a shout meant to drown out someone else's news. It was a bell rung at my own doorway, and whether Melissa recognized the sound as celebration or as an alarm would be her work, not mine. At 11:45, with the comments still rolling and the family thread flashing like a slot machine that finally realizes the handle has been pulled, I set a second, smaller post to publish. A plain sentence with a time and a place and a simple invitation to those who had cheered my sister last night to step into a different kind of room today, and as I pressed confirm I understood that the most satisfying revenge does not slam a door in anyone's face, It opens one so wide that the person who has been accustomed to standing center stage must choose, in front of everyone, whether to walk through or to keep pretending the room they built on other people's moments is the only one that exists. By noon the group thread looked like the aftermath of a parade with confetti no one wanted to sweep, and while notifications stacked and thinned and stacked again like waves hitting the same stubborn rock, I walked the 3 blocks from my apartment to the address I had pasted into that second post, a building I had kept to myself for months because privacy, when you have grown up inside a family that narrates even its grocery lists out loud, begins to feel like a luxury with a lock on it, and I let the slow rhythm of my steps settle my breath because the part of me that used to perform grew quiet the minute I stopped volunteering to be overshadowed. The door to the lobby clicked open with the thrift store bell I had insisted on, not out of whimsy but as a small, domestic sound that says this place will never need an audience to be real. And I moved through the empty hall past the frame that waited on the wall under a square of cloth, past the reception counter that still smelled of fresh varnish, past the 2 windows that face the street where the light comes warm and simple at midday, and I took my place by the table with the carafe of water and the stack of paper cups. A hostess at a party that had been planned not to impress strangers, but to rearrange a story I was tired of hearing. They came in clusters, my parents first with my mother clutching her phone like a worrystone, and my father standing a half step behind as if bracing for a gust, then my aunt with the efficient bag that always carries aspirin and unsolicited advice. Then 2 cousins who apologized for being late even though they were on time, and finally Melissa with her hair pulled into a high knot that had not been negotiated with a mirror, eyes rimmed pink from a sleeplessness she would never confess to anyone but the bathroom sink, and I met them with the kind of smile I use when a meeting room is hot and no one wants to be the one to open a window, respectful and steady and impossible to argue with. My mother started in immediately with the questions, whether this was an office, whether this was a store, whether this was a place I would rent out or live in or use as a tax write-off, and I told her, with gentle authority I honestly wanted for both of us, that this was a place that belonged to me, and that it would make more sense in a minute if she could trust me long enough to let the shape emerge from the lines, which is a fancy way of asking a person to stop narrating their anxiety and wait. Melissa made it exactly 2 beats before she leaned on the counter and asked if this was a prank, her tone light but with a crease running through it like a seam on fabric pulled too hard, and she added, in the careful voice of someone performing consideration, that she was happy for me and that she understood independence better than anyone, but that early pregnancy requires calm and that a flood of attention around the family can be hard to manage when you are trying to do everything right. And as she talked I remembered the many times I had clipped my own sentences short so that hers could stretch, not because mine were less true but because hers came louder, and I felt something in me settle like sediment in a jar that has been shaken for years. I told her, without malice, but without room for negotiation, that my life was not going to be scheduled around the most theatrical person in the room anymore, and that I would be happy to offer her a chair and a glass of water while I spoke for a few minutes, and that I promised no one would faint from generosity if for once the family listened without interrupting. What I said next was not a speech so much as a spine, and I said it in a voice that could hold both relief and discipline. That the photograph I had posted in the morning was not an abstract teaser or a borrowed image, but a record of a signature that had taken a year of quiet to earn. That the keys were not props, but an invitation to step out of the habit of seeing me as the supporting character. That I had decided a long time ago I would not buy anything in order to be seen, but that if I ever bought something it would be because it served a life I did not have to translate into applause for anyone, and that this building, modest as it looks to anyone expecting chandeliers, was the first place I could walk into without explaining why I belonged there. My father's shoulders dropped the way they do when he accepts a reality he cannot fix with a phone call, and my mother blinked the slow blink of someone trying to rearrange furniture in a room without making noise, and behind them Melissa said my name in a small voice that I had heard only once before, the time she called me from a gas station off the highway when her car had died and the followers who text back at midnight did not materialize into a mechanic. Before anyone could claim the moment and rename it, I crossed to the wall and lifted the cloth by its corners, and the brass beneath caught the light in a way I had planned without admitting it to myself, and the letters clean, grounded, undeniable, spelled a name that belongs to all of us, but had always felt like mine alone, our grandmother's given name engraved as if a person could be both a memory and a structure, Evelyn House. The room did not gasp because we are not that family, but my aunt put a hand over her mouth and made a sound I had never heard from her, a single syllable broken in half. And my mother reached for the counter because the past she polished for holidays had just stepped into the present and asked for a chair. I explained, briefly and without apologizing for what I had kept quiet, that when our uncle decided to sell the old bungalow by the shore where we had spent sticky summers peeling oranges on the steps, I had started a line of dominoes that began with a loan and an attorney and a file folder and ended here, that the bungalow itself had been torn down years ago by a developer after a storm, which had felt like a little funeral for the wrong thing, and that I had bought this building in the city with proceeds and patience and a set of plans rolled into a tube under my bed, because if you cannot keep a house you can build one with the same name and let it hold better things than arguments. Melissa's face changed the way a sky changes when a front rolls through, the brightness washing to a pale confusion, then to fury, then to something so raw I had to look briefly at the window to give us both decency, and she asked whether I had done this to prove a point, whether I was trying to erase her news with a plaque and a narrative, whether I could have waited 1 week or 1 day or even 1 hour, and I answered honestly that I did not do this to erase anything, but I did do this to be done with the habit of erasing myself, and that I would not apologize for the timing because the timing had been written long before last night, and then she folded, not gracefully, but like a person who is tired in every place tiredness can live. And she cried the kind of tears that are not performative and not pretty, and she told me in a voice that barely reached across the small lobby that she does not know how to be loved unless people are looking at her, and that the silence between attention scares her more than anything, and that she thought if she made every room brighter no one would notice. She is always terrified of the dark. It would be convenient to claim that my heart hardened at that confession, but the truth is I felt it crack in a way that let in air, and for a moment, a brief unguarded moment, I almost walked across the floor to pull her into a hug and tell her that adults are allowed to be ordinary without dying from it, and that our grandmother made soup from bones and never posted the steam, and that love does not always sound like a standing ovation. Instead, I handed her the small envelope I had kept in my jacket pocket, the one with the pale blue flap and the crisp weight of paper that changes the temperature of a room, and I said that if she wanted me to stop right there, to fold up the afternoon and call the family an hour later with a polite update that would make this day easily forgettable, all she had to do was open the envelope and read the first line out loud. And I watched her fingers hesitate over the seam as the room held its breath and the letters on the plaque gleamed like a promise I could not take back. She slid a fingertip under the pale blue flap as if the paper might bite, and when she finally drew out the single sheet with its sober letterhead and the raised seal that matched the one in my morning photograph, the room gathered itself around her in the way families do when they sense that a story is about to choose a direction, and for a heartbeat I wanted to snatch it back and keep everything mine, not out of cruelty but out of a new, precarious tenderness I did not yet trust. Instead I folded my hands and waited, because patience had gotten me here and impatience had never once kept me safe. The first line, shorter than a prayer and heavier than an apology, stated that the endowment for Evelyn House had been funded in full, not by a faceless donor or an accident of luck, but by the bonus I had earned while leaving parties early to finish the work no one applauds, and by the proceeds I had salvaged when the shore bungalow was sold off like an heirloom at a garage sale, and that the mission, which I spoke into being months ago in a lawyer's office that smelled of carpet cleaner and ink, would be simple, measurable, and stubbornly unglamorous. Free legal clinics on alternating Saturdays for women untangling contracts they never got to read, small grants for certification fees, a quiet studio in the back for anyone building a portfolio while the rest of the house sleeps, and a rotating scholarship named for our grandmother, awarded each year to someone in this city who has Learned to carry grace without witnesses. My mother made a soft sound that could have been pride or grief. My father fixed his gaze on the plaque, as if the brass might teach him how to stand inside a new idea of his daughter, and Melissa kept reading, her mouth shaping the next paragraph with the concentration of a person translating herself, where the offer sat like a coin at the bottom of a clear glass, a board seat reserved for her if she wanted it. Not decorative and not ceremonial, but work that would ask for quiet hours and dull tasks and the kind of attention that does not come with applause, and alongside it a line that described a fund already opened in her child's name, the kind of practical love our grandmother would have called a good start. Contingent on exactly one condition that had nothing to do with my control and everything to do with her peace, that for 1 full year, beginning on the day she signed, she would keep her private life private. Stepping back from the endless call and response of the feed to measure joy in rooms without strangers, while showing up each week at Evelyn House to learn how to be admired by one person at a time, preferably a person who needed something real. The envelope did not threaten, it did not gloat, it did not lock a gate. It simply laid two paths across the same floor, one lit by familiar spotlights and one traced in lamplight, and the choice, which had so often been arranged for me in the past, belonged entirely to her. She looked up and met my eyes with a steadiness I had not seen since we were girls passing notes in the back seat on long drives, and for a suspended moment I believed she might laugh at the audacity of it, or rip the paper in half, or perform one of those pretty collapses that invite the room to rush forward and rescue her from the consequences of a lifetime of beautiful noise. What happened instead was smaller and stranger and far more human, because her shoulders lowered a fraction, her jaw unclenched, and she said my name like a person trying out a word she has always known and never really used, and she asked, without sarcasm or bargaining, whether I had built this to punish her or to save myself. I told her the truth, which is untidy and never makes a clean headline, that I had built it because I was tired of being invisible, and that I had made the offer because I did not know how to write her out of the story without turning into someone I would not want to sit beside, and that the fund for the baby was not bait but insurance against our worst habits, because children deserve better than the performances we mistake for devotion. My aunt exhaled like a punctured tire. My mother wiped her cheeks with the base of her palm in a motion that looked like youth, and somewhere beyond the windows a delivery truck downshifted, reminding me that the world continues to move while families decide what kind of people they are. Melissa did not sign there, which I suppose is what a simpler story would have required. She folded the paper once and slid it back into the envelope with an almost ceremonial care, and she asked if she could think. And I told her that thinking is the only luxury we have ever denied ourselves in a rush to be adored, and that the bell on the door can be unhooked if the noise makes concentration impossible, and that the plaque does not change color if she walks away. She nodded, and in that nod I saw both the girl who could not bear the silence after a recital and the woman who might yet choose a different music, and she placed the envelope in her bag without drama, then surprised herself by asking for the tour, which I gave her in the same tone I would use with any visitor, pointing out the clinic room and the desk that will always have a bowl of granola bars, and the back studio with its soft lamp and its rule written on a card taped to the wall: no photos of unfinished work, because some kinds of growth require privacy the way seedlings require shade. When they left, they did so in twos and ones, my parents with the slow, careful walk of people leaving a church after a wedding where the vows felt risky, my aunt promising to drop off pens and folders as if office supplies could bless a building, and Melissa last, pausing beneath our grandmother's name until I almost spoke and then did not, because the whole point of this new house is that it does not need me to narrate her choices. The lobby returned to quiet, honest in its emptiness, and I unhooked the thrift store bell because I wanted the next person who enters to discover stillness instead of spectacle. My phone, somewhere in my bag, was buzzing itself toward a warm death. Messages piling from friends and colleagues and cousins who would prefer a closing statement, a tidy reveal, a winner and a loser to file under family drama with a moral attached. I let it buzz, and I stood with my palm against the cool brass letters until I could hear my own breath, and I understood that revenge, when it is done with care, is not a blade but a blueprint, A way of building a space where the thing that hurt you can no longer find a chair, and where the person who hurt you is invited, if she wants, to learn a different way to take up room. Whether she will sign, whether the fund will sit dormant or begin to grow, whether the bell will ring again this afternoon or hang quietly like a truce, I do not know, and for once I can live with not knowing. Because I did not post a victory, and I did not post a collapse. I opened a door, I put the keys on the table, and I walked into the light without asking who was watching.